advice, kind of a call to us all. Ask not what Hackney can do for you, what you can do for Hackney. Paying it back, paying it forward, of course, as our great bookshops and coffee houses as a borough would encourage us to do for those less fortunate. We think of bookshops, pages, of course, the incredible pages of Hackney, probably almost 20 years old now, just up the road. And Pages Bookstall will be selling this afternoon Ken WORPOLE's incredible new book, Care of Little Toller, the wonderful place writing publishers based in Bridport in Dorset, brightening from the east, selected essays across an incredible life, a life of observation, of study, of great historical inquiry. We'll be talking about, of course, John Berger today, Ken's relationship with John Berger. I first did an event, I think, with Ken, it was back in the very early 2000s in Clapton Library. It's a real pleasure always to be speaking with Ken. And we're, of course, talking about history being activated in the present for the future. We're in a very historical venue here, of course, Sutton House. A key member of the audience alerted me recently to the fact that this property is now 490 years old this year. It's the oldest residential building in Hackney. Many thanks to the National Trust and everyone here for making this event possible. But of course we have a more contemporary incarnation of relationship to Sutton House, because Sutton House was built by Sir Ralph Sadler in 1535, as I mentioned. Now many of you will not know exactly too much, as I don't, about Sir Ralph. But of course, Sir Ralph, or Sir Ralph as some of us will say, of course. Sir Ralph appeared in WORPOLE. Now WORPOLE, much more familiar to us, of course, incredible trilogy of novels and now television, of course, by the late great Hilary Mantel. Sir Ralph Sadler played in WORPOLE by Thomas Sangster, a young actor, of course, well known for Harry Potter and other films and TV. Now, in a series of incredible links and associations, Thomas Sangster, of course, an actor, there is another Thomas Sangster, very close to this room as I speak, who was once, as a younger man, drawn a gecko by John Berger. And in that picture, John signed the picture, a gecko waiting to pounce. So there we have it, history moving 490 years, collapsed in just 3 relationships, from Sir Ralph Sadler to John Berger. That's how it works. There's an association, a network, particularly around someone like John, who was a great collaborator and had relationships and creative engagements across the world. His centenary next year, John Berger will be 100 next year. I say will be 100 because he is very much with us. As Simon McBurney, the director of Publicité and a very close friend of John Berger, said, now you are everywhere on the 2nd of January 2017 when John died aged 90. He truly is everywhere, but he's here today with us in Sutton House. Please welcome Ken WORPOLE.
It's very hard to live up to that kind of but thanks very much to Gareth. I got to know Gareth actually in 2005 when he organised an enormous European-wide celebration of John Berger's work. And one of the events that remains very memorable to me, it was held at Queen Mary College, and it was about Berger's novel, A Fortunate Man, which is the life of a doctor. And they were lucky to get one of the doctors who had been co-partner with Dr. Sassel, as he was properly called, in that book, to come and speak. And it was enormous. It was a room twice the size of this, and it was filled with radical old GPs, many of them former Communist Party members. And the atmosphere was quite fantastic. And it rooted me very strongly in the idea, which has kind of kept me going really for most of my life, the relationship between East End and a wider view of the world, particularly in recent years my relationship with Essex, because I've always been fascinated by the social dynamics between the East End of London and all kinds of retreats, political communities that have happened in Essex as a kind of response to the poverty of East London. And there is a chapter in the new book about John Berger, because there's so many connections with him for me. I left school at 16. I started trained to be a civil engineer, and it didn't really work out for me. I was completely mentally unsuited for that kind of work. So I then went to college and trained to be a teacher. And in 1967, there was an article in the magazine New Society. Now, of all there are not that many regrets in my life. One is the loss of the magazine New Society. I read it avidly in the 4 years I was at Teachers Training College, and it seemed to me the most marvellous mixture of anthropology, popular culture, documentary history, black and white photography. It was not based in London, it was not centred about what life was like in London or in Westminster. It was decentered, it was about regions, it was about dissident communities and so on. And also it had writers like, obviously, John Berger, so many, I can't even begin to remember their names, but they were all independent, people like Ray Gosling, people like Angela Carter, and they had these distinctive views on how life could be lived in a different way. And I have very strong memories of two things. One is the first time that the world knew about the book, The Fortunate Man, was a short extract from it, published in New Society. And it started with that very famous quote at the beginning of the book, that a landscape is not simply a place, it's also a screen that hides behind it how people manage to live their lives. And that has stayed with me all my life, the relationship between the natural landscape and the human activity that kind of underwrites it. And he also quoted then a Russian proverb that life is not a walk across an open field. And I used it so much that recently the Guardian writer wrote a book about history, and he prefaced it with this beautiful saying, life is not a walk across an open field, quite Ken Walpole. To me, a Russian proverb. So this is John Berger. He was born in Hackney in 1926. Interesting antecedents, Jewish from Czechoslovakia, former Czech Republic, and also Trieste. His father converted to Catholicism before the First World War, fought in the First World War, was decorated in the First World War, and came to live at 1 Filey Road, Filey Avenue in Hackney. He converted to Christianity. He was very civic-minded. He ran the scout troop in Hackney, and both he and his wife, which is his mother, were very keen scouts. And John grew up here, but his father then managed to move to Surrey, and John went to Chelsea College of Art and then the Royal College of Art, became an artist. But he was born in Hackney, and he did remember this. So there's that. The Fortunate Man, secondly, apart from this notion of the landscape and our relationship to the landscape, the second thing was the note of vocation. And I was lucky enough to go to a teacher training college which was filled with older people who had either been leader sites who were dedicated to the idea that victims could open up and moralise and solidly well, or very elderly women who'd been trained under Susan Isaacs, had been part of the New Era Fellowship and had this wide Freudian notion of the centrality of the experience of childhood and how the key important thing all of us as teachers should do is listen to children. And not only listen to children, well, mainly because it was often said, the one thing children were not allowed to do in school is to speak. How could they ever kind of recover or build an identity if speech is really the main formative action in how we relate to the world? So I was lucky to train as a teacher in Brighton Teachers Training College in that time. And the idea of teaching as a vocation really resonated with me and many of my friends. And that's what happened when I came to Hackney to work at Hackney Downs. saw it as a way of kind of bringing something new to an area that I had actually come from, because people don't know this, but I was actually brought to Mother's Hospital in Hackney, Salvation Army Hospital in 1944. Not quite literally true, because I was born in a castle, works of the castle in Derbyshire, which is where all the pregnant women in Hackney and Tower Hamlets were evacuated to during the war, and I was born during the war. So I got this dual identity. One is a son, child of the castle, and the other child of the Salvation Army. It's a pretty rich mix. At Hackney Down School, I was lucky to meet two very exceptional people. The librarian who arrived the same year as I did, 1969, was a woman called Margaret Gosley. And we immediately recognised each other as kind of young radicals and so on. And she brought something new to this course. The library was a rather dull place. And it had been the sort of practice that if you weren't bad enough to be sent to the headmaster, that you'd be sent to the library. So the kind of idea that the library is some kind of punishment. And Margaret Gosley kind of started buying James Baldwin, lots of books, winning lots of increasing number of young black children, Jewish children, and so on. And the library became a kind of centre. Little Red School book for children, all that stuff, those kinds of discussions. She got encouraged a discussion group there. And, you know, we recognised a fellow admiration or whatever. And the other important person was Anne Pettit. Anne Pettit was the teacher of reading for those who were regarded as remedial, but in need of kind of more education in kind of views of reading. And one of the people that she took was a young boy called Vivian Usher, the young black boy, who was in my class, my four. And Anne Pettit too had a radical background, which was proven when she left school. She went to Wales, and it was from her cottage in Wales that the Green Commons March first started. So, and Margaret Gosley happened to be married to Graham Thompson, who the black founder of Centreprise. So there was this kind of connection. Centreprise was beginning to be connected to this other things going on. Glenn was especially important in Hackney, but especially important in relationship to John Berger's beginning setting up of the Writers and Readers Foundation. I keep forgetting to move slightly. I can't, there's no point in, just can you move on?
Well, this is the question.
Yeah, here are just some of the books. These are just from some of my collection. It was a very wide range of writings. I mean, historical, about art, about politics, about animals, how we look at animals, and so on. So he wrote about 40 books, and every one of them is completely different. And a lot of them were in the essay tradition. But to me, the fortunate man, apart from the thing about what it was to have a vocation, was also the relationship between text and photography. So if we go, if we can. So these were two books that were very important to me. And then in later life, my wife became a photographer. So it was lovely. The Fortunate Man, The Seventh Man. The Seventh Man was a book that he did with the photographer John Moore about immigrant labourers coming from the Third World or the Global South into Europe to work, often in very poor conditions, often with break-up of family life, often men without women, so to speak. And if we look at the next one, by my Evans. So, at Centreprise, after 4 years at Hackney Downs, I talked to Glenn, with Margaret, we were in jointly to see some possible sites for the bookshop. And when he set it up, I said at some point that we should start doing some publishing. And we set up an oral history project for the people who are Hackney, as well as beginning to publish children's writing, young people's writing, from at the same time as in Stepney Priscill's publishing Stepney Works. And we were looking for young black children, young black men and women who were writing poetry and stories to try to bring in to the curriculum other voices which were not there. I mean, if you looked at the reading materials then in use in the late 1960s for children, they were banal, very white, very suburban, and reading became a very hot political topic. Whether there was life after Ladybird books. And Vivian Usherwood's poems, which he had been encouraged to write by Anne Pettit, and in the library, he'd been encouraged to write by Anne Pettit, that's right, in the library managed by Margaret Gosby. We all took these poems to Glenn and said, let's publish them. Initially they were duplicated, they were very popular, they were circulated in the Hackney Down School, other school teachers saw them, wanted them, it then became printed, and within 5 years it was the top-selling poetry book by a black writer in Britain. And it's now been anthologised in a number of seminal black anthologies of British black writing. So that was the writing side of it, but the oral history side of it really took its influence from the Berger books. As you can see, Working Lives Volume 1, Working Lives Volume 2, they were all oral history projects run under the auspices of the Hackney Workers' Education Association, run from an evening class, using photographers from the community. And if we look at the next one, if we can go. Now you can see I've chosen that the first one on the left is Dr. Sassel in his West Country practice, talking at a meeting in Village Hall. And one of many photographs made more poignant by the fact that we know, as they did at that 2005 meeting of doctors in the East End of London, that Dr. as told by one of Dr. Sassel's colleagues who spoke at the meeting, that Dr. Sassel took his own life after his wife died a couple of years later after the book was published. It was very tragic. But you can see the way the photographer's got him holding the room. And that's exactly the way in a photograph by Sally Greenhill of a health worker whose name I've got on a piece of paper and I'll tell you we should get her name right. There we have it. Oh yes, we have. That's Joy Hendry, a health visitor. And you can see that the photographic style is actually exactly the same. It's that kind of slightly distant, but feeling the mood of the room, that there's something happening, that change is happening in that period. Yeah, that's paid. Yeah. So Glenn got very excited about this publishing science enterprise, and he was one of those people. It used to be a slow movement, radical kind of community activist, that either you should give up after 5 years, or if you haven't given up for 5 years, the other people in the project should kill you. Because the idea of the person who sets something up hanging on in there is actually often not a great success story. They become very proprietary, they kind of contain the history and so on. So Glenn, in 1973, met with John Berger, and they were very keen to carry on the tradition of finding new voices to publish. And in 1974, they set up the Writers and Readers Publishing Cooperative. Glenn carried on publishing to the end of his life. He died, sadly, in 2001 at the age of 60. And John Berger was up and wrote the obituary for the Guardian. A beautiful obituary. I wish we can read one short paragraph from the next one. And Berger wrote of him, books became the centre of this work, because they created this world, the one he had known on the streets. Glenn Thompson did not learn to read until he was 9. His father, he was brought up in Brooklyn. His father was in and out of prison, and it was the time of the Vietnam War, and Glenn became a draft resistant. Came to Europe, travelled around Europe, and in Denmark particularly, he came across this new kind of social formation called the book cafe. And the idea of having a cafe, that was also a bookshop, struck him as being, you know, impressive. This is the way things could go. He was fairly resistant, sceptical about just left-wing bookshops, which tended to be kind of dominated by a single voice of this is, if you come in here, this is what you should, we would hope we would like to think. But the idea of having a cafe where people talk was then instituted at number 34 Dawson Lane in 1971. That itself is a very important part of Hackney's history, because Dawson Lane then was all scheduled for redevelopment. So all the leases on the shops there were only for 3 years, and they were perpetual rent because it expected that they would all be demolished in 1974 in order to put an 8-lane highway from the M11 going right through past St Pancras and out the other side to join up at Westbourne Road. Well, that was the last. It didn't happen, and some of those shops are still there 60 years later. It inspiring another kind of project which I think has been very useful to Hackney while I'm thinking about it, and those meanwhile uses. The garden, the curved garden. You take a project that's nominally slated to be developed at some point later stage, you negotiate, if you can, cleverly, and you get it, and if you do something good enough with it, it will stay there. So that was Centreprise. It was there for 3 years initially. The project, the whole project, after moving to Kingston Road, lasted 40 years. Okay, next one.
I just stretched my legs and the live screen changed. Oh yes, that's your perfect, yeah, great work. Thank you.
So let's say I met Gareth in 2005. By then he was already known as John Berger's representative on Earth. And we had this amazing national or international celebration of Berger's work. And this is the new book of mine. It contains the essay on Berger in it. But I think Gareth and I are now thinking of next year, which will be the centenary of Berger's birth in Filey Avenue. And how that's going to, we've had 2 events so far, one at Hackney Archives, and another one, or is that to come?
There's any more to come yet next year. I'll make an announcement on the website.
Yeah. So Berger was born in Hackney. He left, his ideas circulated, and in many ways they came back to Hackney through, I think, notably people like Margaret Gosley, who he married, Anne Pettit, and obviously Glenn Thompson, who set up Centreprise. And I like to think that that notion of well, the one is, Glenn had a very strong sense of vocation. I mean, it was the job, in the sense of the old Maoist philosophy. If you know, teach it. If you don't know, learn. But everything was really about learning and sharing knowledge and sharing information. And I'd like to finish with the next and final slide on May. John Berger died in 2017, and there was a decision to organise an event commemorating that at the And in that month, these posters went up illicitly in all the illuminated bus shelters around Stoke Newington, put up by a man who refused ever to give us a name, although he did come to the opening, called stencil poster.
Protest stencil.
Protest stencil, yeah. And these went up in all the illuminated books, illegally in all the illuminated. And at the end of the Stoke Newington Book Festival, you were the auctioneer?
Yeah.
Gareth was the auctioneer. We decided to auction one of these enormous posters to raise money for Palestine, educated Palestine. And to my great surprise, the woman opposite, it started off at £10, 20, 50, 100. And there was a kind of thing going on in it, you know, what people really want this for. And the woman sitting next to me at some point said, I'll bid £550, but as long as it goes and stays alive. And it was opened or unveiled by Catcher Berger in December of that year. And it now sits permanently in CLR James Line. So, in many ways, John has come home, and next year there'll be a whole series of events around him. But I wonder, Gareth, if we could kind of just carry on this as a conversation.
Absolutely, Cam. You should say who the woman was who bought the poster.
Well, I can't without crying.
No. Someone very close to Ken surprisingly put that money on the table with the proviso that the poster goes into public circulation, which it did. And it was originally hung in Stoke Newington Library, which of course you'll know is being redeveloped now. And so it's in CLR James Library. But thank you so much, Ken. I mean, the sense of John in the 70s as an active force in the culture, of course, was wider than that. He said 1972 was his big year. He made Ways of Seeing with Mike Dibb, and he won the Booker Prize, for G, with this very distinctive splitting of the prize money between his own research for A Seventh Man and giving it to the British Wing of the Black Panthers to buy a property in North London. What was your sense, outside of kind of the circle of friends and fellow travellers? Did you feel that there was that kind of that voice breaking out into wider audiences? And obviously the television series was fundamental. But how was, if you were speaking to people who weren't close to you, was John an active force at that point?
Very much so, because you never knew what was going to come next. I mean, a book called Looking at Animals would be very surprising if it was coming from John Berger. It was a collection of essays. And there were poems. I mean, the book, I've got several favourites. One is The Red Tender of Bologna, which is a book simply about the colour of the street lines of the shops that come down during the hot sunshine, which is a particular pigment of red. And the story is of meeting an uncle there who lived in Bologna, who takes him on a tour and talks about the politics and so on. And Bologna is very important to me because I've travelled there several times with my wife, who was a photographer. We did a big book on cemeteries, and particularly cemeteries around the Italian resistance in the Second World War. We were very kindly put up by some communist members of the local authority in Bologna. And the other one is much more closer to home. And again, there's a very strong sense of place here, which is here. Here is where it is. And Here is Where It Is Me is one short story in which many of the people he knew come back to life and tell him about what life was like. And it's an unusual formula, particularly for someone who, as I said to you, a Marxist, to take the voices of the dead as being as real as the voices of the living. And Gareth, you and I know one of our favourites is a story where he goes to Portugal, to a Porto, I think, and he's walking down the street one day and he meets his mother. And they go for coffee, And he tells her, he said, well, she said, you look a bit worried or something. What's wrong? He said, well, it's a bit uncomfortable. He said, there's our next door neighbour's got a dog, and they keep it on the chain. It barks all the time, it's really. And she says, well, this is very interesting. She said, because what we learn from life is that if you just add, 2 more meters to the chain, the dog will be able to get to, the water and to the food, and it will quieten down. And it's through notions, it's to do with repairing the world. We don't need to change the world, we need to repair it in small ways so that it kind of knits back together more coherently. And that does, of course, relate to a very Jewish subscription that there are somewhere 32 people, we don't know who they are, always in the world, whose job it is to repair it on our behalf. But repair and Berger go together to me. I mean, he left London in 1968 when everybody thought it was all happening, and Berger, I think, already thought this is not what I want to happen. Just demonstration. And that's when he went to live in the Haute-Savoie to become a kind of farmer, because I think he was very disillusioned in that kind of politics and went back to notions of return to the land and then this notion of repair and making things good again, not overturning things, but doing the small alterations, oiling the small bits of the machinery that make things work without total disruption or total disturbance.
No, I mean that's very powerful and absolutely spot on, I think. I mean, you mentioned earlier, he was never a dogmatic Marxist, he was never someone for rhetoric and just for a kind of a simple call without that much subtle or textured idea of lived experience informing creativity. But Ken, if we go back to that idea of repair, of course, the work you were doing in the schools with publications was absolutely about repairing a kind of a division between pupils and between communities and the larger borough and city, country, and so on. What was your sense of writers and readers? Because when we look at the city now, we look at Hackney, of course, there is so much change, constant building, rebuilding, demolition, etc. Unless you know the history of buildings and you can see what was there and kind of bring it back like Berger did his mother into your present, there's no way of knowing really. What was there, unless, of course, one of the events like this happened. Writers and readers, of course, produced many books. Crucially, many people will know the Beginners series, For Beginners, which was a graphic novel series about all sorts of issues, Freud, Cuba, Marx, etc. Which then split into two strands in the UK and in the US with Glenn Thompson and Thatcher America. But writers and readers, of course, produces something, produces books. Yeah. But how do you think now about this kind of history happening, which, of course, this festival is evidence of that continuing? But what is its day-to-day lived reality for you?
Well, people ask me, if someone to ask me my favourite railway journey in the world, I would say it's from Stoke Newington station to Liverpool Street station. Because it goes many ways above the rooftops. I mean, you look down on this absolutely exquisite palimpsest of periods, of types, of parks, of cemeteries, of Victoriana, of modernism, of workshops and graffiti. And I think what we are doing in this room is back to speaking with the dead. We're bringing the dead back into this room. We're bringing Berger back, we're bringing Glenn Thompson back, luckily Anne Pettit and Margaret Russell are still alive. But it's that continuing conversation between the generations that seems to me so important to Berger. And it was in the end to do with the human voice. It goes back to this astonishing thing that when I was trained to be a teacher, the very good of the old radical women who were in the kind of Freudian New Era fellowship mode it's absolutely shocking that the one thing you children cannot do in school is to speak. silence was the rule. And hearing people's voices, allowing people to speak, creating forms through which they can speak in life, is absolutely central to this whole project thing. Whether it's the Hackney WA, whether it's John Berger, whether it's Hackney Society, and the publication. We've got 5 more minutes. Sorry. So yeah, they're in the room. It's all in the room. Where we meet.
We're in the room. I have heard that Michael Portillo was offered that railway journey. It was one of his great railway journeys. And he actually said, "Can I do the Orient Express instead?" I think why. We've got 5 minutes to have. I think we've got a little bit longer actually. We have to be out by 10:02. But let's go to you, the audience. It's about a public event here. It's about shared voices. Thinking about the history of the borough, of John Berger, and the writers and readers culture, Centre and into the future. Any thoughts, comments, responses about your own sense of history in Hackney? These stories intertwining with your own biography? Or the experiences of others. Any thoughts at this point? We're at the beginning of the day of history here in Hackney. Some of you might be saving your question energy for later. Spill it wantonly now, because Ken will obviously be disappearing off into the crowd and will be available more informally, I'm sure. But any thoughts about what you've heard so far, or your own experience of radical Hackney from the 70s onwards? There's a gallery. I'm playing to the gallery now. Incredible scenes up there. Do you have a question?
Does he have any streets named after him?
Great question. Does he have a street named after him?
No, he doesn't.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah,
I mean,
nor a paint factory.
nor a paint factory. I mean, there might be a Berger Street, but it hasn't been formally, as far as we know, named after it. What's interesting about Filey Avenue is that you can go to 1 Filey Avenue. Obviously, don't peering too much through the neck curtains. But he was born in 1 Filey Avenue, and in a strange conjunction, a little bit similar to what I was suggesting in the introduction. Filey was where Mike Dibb, the director of Ways of Seeing, lived. So when he first met John Berger and discovered that Filey Avenue and Filey were what glued them, the very foundation of their origins, that just confirmed in Mike's mind, perhaps less so in John's mind, that they were destined to work together indefinitely, which they basically did. I was in Bromley last weekend on a little walking tour there, and the person leading it took us to David Bowie's house, which has a blue plaque, but many people know that blue plaques are now closed to new submissions, have been for a few years now. So somebody had made that blue plaque themselves spontaneously. It was slightly smaller, a bit less blue than the official blue plaque. But what it said was, yeah, Janet, hold, let me just finish this anecdote, and then we're going to do whatever you need to do, yeah? It said David Bowie, a talented musician, lived here. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Adjectives haven't been a big part of the blue plaque operation until now. But I think that potentially next year we should put John Berger, a rather okay writer. A reasonable scribe. Was born here in 1926. Could do better. Janet, over to you.
No, I was just going to say on the plaque point. So the Hackney Society is starting a plaque scheme. So perhaps we can work together to get a plaque for John Berger.
We absolutely can. Absolutely. We'll think about the wording from now onwards. It's the big day. Thank you, Janet. Brilliant. Yes, please.
Well, it isn't of general interest, but did either of you know the photographer Libby Hall, who was a very close friend of John Berger? Can you say anything? Because
yeah.
She was married to a left-wing
cartoonist and
cartoonist,
yeah.
that's the word.
Tony Hall. Yeah, Libby Hall, a wonderful woman who lived Bird Road, just up at Clapton. She met John in Geneva in the early 60s. They were friends for 60 years. She was a great collector and photographer of dogs. She had, I think, the world's largest collection of photos of dogs.
But many more things than dogs.
No, she had many more things. I'm not just mentioning the dogs.
Her own photographs were absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, no, she's an incredible person. But she knew John very, very well. And part of her early biography informed a film that Alain Tanner, the Swiss filmmaker, made with John's involvement about a trip to North Africa. Which was a very significant part of her early life, and became a significant film for the relationship between John Berger and Alain Tanner, who perhaps some of you will know, Swiss director who died several years ago. They made a number of films together. The most famous film perhaps is Jonah, who will be 25 in the age 2000, which is one of the great films of some of the things we've been talking about with Ken this morning, about how we live together in a challenging society, how we kind of make community and coexistence. A great film, you can find it online. Joan will be 25 in the year 2000. She's 50 years old next year, so we'll definitely be showing that. But Libby Hall, yes, a key figure in keeping John's kind of presence active and engaged in London over all those decades that he was very much away from it. When the season happened, he realised that London had changed a lot, and he then spent much more time here and was very engaged in all sorts of things in the city. Thank you. Yes, please.
You mentioned some of the connection between John's identity and his thinking and work with his idea of the lamb and compare the world, which is a Jewish idea. And I just wondered, you talked about the assimilation of his parents when he came to the UK, and I just wondered if there are any other connections with John's Jewishness and his work that you have from his exploration.
Could you come on with
Yeah, so a question about more connection with John's Jewishness in his work and writing. It's a very interesting point. He didn't take on that identity publicly or even creatively until very, very late in his life. His younger brother Michael is the family's kind of genealogist, as it were, digging into the family tree, as Ken said, origins in the Czechoslovakia as it was, or before the Soviet period, and also in Trieste. He was uncomfortable about it, I think, because of his other political affiliations. But later in life, he took on very much the radical anti-Zionist Jewish position, absolutely. He wouldn't write about it because he didn't feel that he knew that history enough. I remember doing an event with him at the British Library, one of the last events he did in London. And you get to the point, as we will do very shortly, where you say any more questions, and you've made it clear that there's just maybe a minute or so before the event has to finish. And somebody at the back said, John, thank you so much for your words tonight. Just wondering what you think the solution to the Israel-Palestine question is. And he did this very distinctive thing where he would put his head in his hands. And he would never answer a question by rote. He would never repeat an answer that he made before. If you see, you can find many television programmes and interviews with him online, and he'll always be answering in the present tense. So in a way, that question identified for him, obviously this kind of schism in his identity, which he couldn't resolve in 10 seconds, far from it. And so he didn't feel that he was able to speak honest about that. That's a question I can't answer at this point. But no, it's much more, I think, coded into the deeper structures of the writing. Like Ken said, the idea of repair is very strong in Here Is Where We Meet. But he never says it in that way. He doesn't declare, just as he doesn't declare other political positions in the way that maybe writers with a similar political persuasion would.
We should say that there is a biography being written about John Berger by Tom Overton, which is due to be published next year. I don't know how long he's been working on it, many years.
About 15 years.
15 years. And I think it's probably an impossible task. I mean, I'm sure he'll do a wonderful job. But Berger corresponded on a daily basis with dozens of people, political prisoners all over the world, with intellectuals all over the world, with editors and photographers. And he visited art galleries, and he painted, and he sent postcards to people. He was endlessly productive in a variety of forms. So I suspect, actually, we're going to be seeing next year not simply Tom Overton's biography, but, people like John Christie. There will be anthologies, there will be collections of postcard drawings, of paintings, of new art criticism. There's still kind of treasure house, again unpublished. And someone like John Christie, I think, will be carrying on working.
No, that's right. There will be. There's a website called John Berger Home, which is set up by a family, by Eve Berger, John's son, who still lives in the village where John lived in the French Alps. So John Berger Home will be listing all the events and republications. As Ken said, there's a number, at least 6 or so in the UK, including republication of translations of Brecht's poems for the theatre. As Ken mentioned, with John Christie, the artist and filmmaker, a trip that John made with 2 American nuns to Corbusier's Ronchamp Cathedral, which is not something you necessarily expect, but that's a new book as well. A collection of John's forewords and afterwords as well, which many of which have never been gathered before outside of other collections. It is worth celebrating Tom Overton, I think, because after the season happened, some of you will know John Berger gave his archive to the British Library. He didn't charge for it. He was invited to think about giving it, and he gave it, of course, because he said, what price can I put on my own life, and what price can I put on all the collaborations in it? But the only requirement was that Jamie Andrews, the head of modern manuscripts, which interestingly in the British Library case started in 1100. That's a modern manuscript department, so he's got quite a lot of work on his shelf. Had to go to the Haute Savoie to collect it and bring in the harvest, which was part of the requirement of all the people who rented in the village. So you can go onto the British Library podcast, touch wood you can after the cyber attack, and find that podcast where Jamie's just about to roll his sleeves up and go into the field. But that led Tom Overton to classify the archive. He then produced 2 books, which many of you perhaps will have, Portraits and Landscapes, Great Histories of Artists and Ideas of Art from John's writing. As I mentioned, he's been writing, since that beginning of that process, he's been writing biography. But as Ken suggested, they keep finding bags of letters under the stairs in Geneva and something behind the pig pen in the Haute Savoie. It's kind of infinite, but he's locking it off pretty soon. It's going to be called Go Closer, because that's what John always urges to do, is go closer and look in more detail, pay attention, in that way. But I think there was another question here. There was somebody has a
I
hand
think
up.
you sort of answered it, but if you could recommend or choose one favourite book by Berger, what would it be?
A Fortunate Man.
Yeah. And why?
Well, I think it was unusual in the tension, not the tension between the photographer and the writer. They're not, one's not illustrating the other. They're both trying to say different things, and in the tension between them, it's very rich. Another, for personal reasons, that he re-established the notion of vocation, which in a world in which work is wholly kind of defined in terms of labour, which is only of economic value. I mean, it made a great impression on me as a teacher.
But thank you. I mean, I was absolutely endorsed that one. But, for me, I guess, And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. It's one of his thinnest books. It's a book of fragments and short pieces, poetry, essays, art criticism. Maybe 100 pages. And Our Faces, My Heart, Brief as Photos. But arguably, it's his most personal book in all sorts of ways. And to bring things sort of full circle with the talk here, it was originally published by Writers and Readers, the cooperative he set up with Glenn Thompson and Lisa and Richard Agnesi, Chris Searle, and the others Ken mentioned. And it's an incredible book that's been read for Radio 4 by Simon Burney, etc. But it has probably one of the greatest final pages, a single page paragraph, in any book I've ever read by anybody, which I won't spoil, but do please find out. And in a way, that is a kind of bringing together of the living and the dead with an active, ongoing, engaged way, which is heartbreaking but also incredibly energising. I hope Pages will have it. I'm sure they do. They can get it in for you, of course. Please find Ken's book, Brighton from the East, at the table. I think it opens in the early afternoon, doesn't it?
There are books on the table now.
There are books on the table now. Please engage with that table and the books on it, and all the other, of course, events and books attached to events throughout the Hackney History Festival. Thank you very much for coming out so early. Thanks to Janet again, and please do now thank Ken Woolfolk.